Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. So this week, we're talking about airlift. You know, we often focus on the combat air force like fighters and bombers. Yeah, they're sexy. But make no mistake, those capabilities are crucial, but we have to get real, because without the ability to deploy those forces into a combat theater and keep them supplied, we lose the fight before it ever began. And it's not just an Air Force problem. The entire joint force depends on U.S. Air Force airlift. No domain, land, sea, air, or space, could successfully project force without the men and the women of Air Mobility Command, the planes they fly, and the enterprise that powers them. But we've got a major problem because, like everything else, for too long, the nation has underinvested in its Air Force airlift. And we talk about this all the time, the chronic underfunding of the service. And that this mission area is no different, but it's absolutely foundational. You know, we're asking the airmen who execute this mission to do more with an inventory that's half of what we had at the end of the Cold War. And it's a recipe for burnout, and maybe even defeat. But it's not all doom and gloom. Options do exist to help reset the inventory to ensure that our Air Force's airlift capabilities and capacity better align with what the nation is asking of it, but we will need more resources. Joining us for today's conversation is General Mike Minihan. General, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Good to see you.
I'm delighted. General Minihan was the former commander of Air Mobility Command, and he's passionate and knowledgeable about this topic like none other. And he's also the key reason why we are optimistic about potential solutions, because he started laying the foundation for a reset during his leadership tenure. And we've also got our own non-resident fellow, Dr. Rob Owen. Rob, thank you for being here.
Oh, great to be here. Thank you.
And Rob is a retired Air Force colonel and an airlift practitioner and scholar. Rob just wrapped up a report for us on this topic, and we will share that with our show notes, and you can also check it out on our website. So, gentlemen, I tried to explain it in my opener, but I'd like to hear from each of you in your own words. Why is the Air Force airlift fleet so crucial? Sir, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you. I describe, and I think what you described, and I put a little crisp and certainly passionate bumper sticker on it, and I say that the mobility fleet is the most relied upon force in the history of warfare. And so I've said that in public spaces. I've yet to be challenged. Not one person has ever come up to me and said, you're wrong, and listed some.
1,000% agree with you.
Yeah. So, and I don't say that to be arrogant. I certainly don't say it to seek sympathy, but I say it as that whether you're projecting power or projecting hope, you require air mobility to get it done. And while it's the most relied upon force in the history of warfare, it's also the most wounded, the most vulnerable, the least connected, and the least integrated. So those things are in tension, and they get after exactly how you opened the show, which I think was on point. And it's going to be hard for me to just talk about airlift. I realize the title of this podcast is about airlift, but I view that whole mobility fleet, the airlift, the air refueling, certainly the air medical evacuation, and the things on the ground that make them successful all need enormous investment. If I had just one bumper sticker before I turn it over to Rob and have him correct me to 100%, I'd say this. We absolutely need B-21. We absolutely need F-47. We need CCAs. We need EXs. We need the old E's. We need all of that and the things that make them successful. We have to finish the sentence. As advocates for air power, we have to finish the sentence. And I realize that's broader than just airlift and tanking. Battle management comes to mind. Electronic warfare comes to mind. All the other things that make our
personal. But we can't do any of that if we don't have the mobility part of the equation.
You got it. So I'm not looking for anything more than advocating for let me please have the team to make the pointy end successful. And then the last thing I'll end on is it's time for this country to resolve this issue. We either need to pay for the Air Force that this country needs, or live with the Air Force it pays for. And I think option 2 is not an option. We need to win resourcing arguments so that we can deliver the Air Force that this country needs.
Well, and it's not just about the Air Force. If we don't resource the Air Force the country needs, none of the other services can do what they do.
Yeah, and I hope you follow up on that. This gets at the most relied upon force in the history of warfare. I mean, I say that confidently. Everybody's agility concept counts on us. I made a career, as did Rob, of moving heavy Army, heavy Marines, heavy Navy, heavy Air Force around this world. And I love all of that, but I want to make them successful. I want to maneuver. I really do think this is about maneuver. We talk about logistics, amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics, but victors study maneuver. Putting our capabilities in a position of advantage so that they can be lethal is what we're trying to do here. And that we will not be tested like the tests that may happen in the Pacific. And we've got to be ready for that, which means we've got to change, we've got to invest, and we've got to balance the enabler force with the pointy end because we want them to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Rob, I don't know how you add to that, but go ahead.
Well, allow me to take another 30 minutes, but no, I would reiterate, first of all, just literally everything that General Minihan said. I might express it differently, but we're both on the same frequency on this. Mm-hmm. I would encapsulate just say that, air mobility is the other part of our warfighting capability. It needs to be treated as an integral part of what we do, not a sidebar, not just something that happens. I always like Napoleon's adage that when a new campaign starts, the colonels worry about tactics, the generals worry about campaign, and the marshals worry about logistics. It's real easy if you underestimate the importance to find yourself in a self-imposed trap. If we continue going where we are with great warfighting concepts that involve going forward, dispersing, taking on stronger enemies, and so on, and our logistics aren't together, then all we're really doing is establishing a prisoner of war list for the enemy. You can't ignore it. The only other thing I would add on is General Minihan mentioned that air mobility also includes tankers and command and control, and it certainly does, but I think you really can't understand the whole problem unless you make a study of warfighting in general. How does the Navy do things? How does the Army do things? Why does the Army have to take 20,000 people forward to put 2,000 troops on the line? What's the difference between a brigade combat team or a battle group? Those are things that are really important questions to our job and our ability to talk to we always use the word customers, I would say comrades, to understand what they need and also to challenge them sometimes. Do you really need that? A brigade combat team is a mobility issue, and we need to understand it because it's an air mobility issue. But as far as air mobility, everything that moves takes a lot of air mobility, and we don't have a lot of air mobility anymore. That's really the issue of what's going on here, and it's a danger.
Yeah.
So I think that would be my summary.
And I think you phrased that perfectly because when the Air Force was slashed in half after the end of the Cold War, our air mobility fleet was also victim to that. And I don't think there's a real appreciation for what that did to the entire DoD's ability to project power. And sorry, I loved how you said project hope as well. Now, Rob, you came of age in the Cold War. Talk to us about the scale and the scope of the airlift inventory that existed back then.
Well, approximately, it was twice as large as the one we have today, and it was significantly newer. It was more reliable. Particularly the C-141 was an amazing airplane for both capacity and reliability and speed. So when we launched one, it usually went out and came back, and that was true for the C-5s. They were new. And the C-130s were never quite as the same on maintenance, but they were very good compared to some of the later airplanes we have in our inventory. So we were reliable and we were big and we had a relatively simple mission spread. Basically, we supported the nuclear mission, whatever that took. Mm-hmm. That always had first priority, but the other priority was real simple. It was Europe. It's in Europe. Europe is only about 2,800 miles away, which meant that we could send a 141 out and back, almost send a C-130 out and back in a day. So if we had 200 C-141s, we had 200 sorties a day, times 40 tons, then we had 8,000 tons, and we could make calculations. Also, the continent was developed. There were airfields everywhere, and there were unpaved airfields everywhere, and there were dozens and dozens of highway strips that were as good as a normal runway. So we had lots of places to operate. We could disperse relatively easy. We could shift the flow from a damaged airbase to one that hadn't been hit. So we had a lot of capacity. We had a concept that's sort of been forgotten too, and that was called the 10-10-10. And that was a commitment that within the first 10 days of the conflict, we would have 10 divisions and 10 fighter wings up and fighting. And that involved a lot of pre-positioning for 3 divisions worth of equipment that were in Luxembourg, and the movement of actually one entire division, equipment and all, plus the personnel for another division or so. We had 6 divisions plus a couple of regiments in place. So that was a comment. And that meant soaking forces off from the Pacific. The Pacific was if we could do it, when we could do it. Europe was everything.
You know, one thing, Rob, that you brought up that's interesting to me because it differs so much from what we look at in the Pacific is the number of runways, right? I mean, we don't have the same number of runways. So you don't have alternates, you don't have excess capacity to be able to surge capability and forces into the theater. The other thing is the distances. The distances in the Pacific mean that those ranges is time. So it's going to take you so much longer to be able to get forces or other airlift there. And that impacts your ability to tempo. So the shorter you go, the more frequently you can sortie, so you can do more with less. But now we're going to need more to do more.
You hear everybody talk about the tyranny of distance in the Pacific, but it's also the tyranny of water. I think you absolutely described. I mean, you know, the reality is everywhere is a long ways away. But you know, in Europe, as Rob accurately described, you're never more than 100 miles from a NATO runway, an ally that's been working with you for decades. And in the Pacific, it's 12 hours and you don't see land. I mean, it's incomparable. But it's also the water. The inability to do exactly the hub and spokes normally could be hundreds of miles away or 500 or less, or now thousands and thousands of miles away. So the criticality of the Pacific, the criticality, I think, of aligning our aspirations to what could be successful in the Pacific. If you can do that, then you can solve every other adversary on the planet. I get it. There's nuances and challenges for each, but let's focus on extreme long-range precision and extreme long-range projection of power. And if we can do that in the Pacific, including inside the first island chain, then I think our life is better everywhere on the planet.
You know, and what's shocking to me is, and we've had some incredible logisticians and air mobility professionals as fellows here at the Mitchell Institute, is that, you know, when we think about the Pacific, we think about pure conflict. It's always the pointy noses of the combat air forces that get all the love and get all the thought leadership. But the air mobility piece, the agile combat employment piece, it's all about the logistics. And that is maneuver, sir, as you said. How should we be thinking about this in a more sophisticated manner that's really going to win the war for us?
Well, you know, we often talk about ACE, and I thought the podcast a few weeks ago with Rob and General Deptula really did a good job at this. We talked about ACE, and we should talk about ACE. You know, ACE for air mobility is not just something you're supporting, it's also something you're doing too. But every service agility concept, whether you're talking MDTF for the Army, EABO for the Marine Corps, DMO for the Navy, you know, whatever the agility concept out there is counting on an Air Force tail to maneuver it around. Even our ratio of our high-end fighters to the amount of lift that's required to move that, incredible what we'll do. The 73 C-17 sorties it took to move the Patriot battery out of the Pacific to the Middle East. How about when I was working COVID as the chief of staff or the DCOM at Indo-PACOM to move an Army hospital unit out of Washington State into the Pacific was like 42 C-17s. You know, guess what my boss said? We'll go find something else. I mean, that's how heavy we are. And then my experience as Air Mobility Command, I came in right after the Kabul evacuation. I was right there in the middle of it for the initial Ukraine response, the Israel response, the Gaza response, the retrograde out of Niger, all that. We are not in a position to explode into theater. You know, we are heavy. The problem statement I came up with when I was at Air Mobility Command, we're not as ready, integrated, or as agile as we think we are. And so this requires a sophisticated approach. I think maneuver is the right thing. I think we need to look at the tenets of air power. If we were to do a cold, hard aircrew style debrief, right, and look at all the tenets of air power and say, which ones have we lost custody of? Mike Minihan's answer would be, we've lost custody of balance. We already talked about that. The balance of the force needed to project power and project hope. But it's the persistence aspect. We're barely persistent in a permissive environment. Let's please try to get persistent in a non-permissive environment and be able to handle the low threat all the way up to the high threat. And let's be clear, we've lost custody of that and we need it back.
Manage your money on your time with 24/7 digital banking on the PenFed mobile app. Easily make payments, transfer funds, and deposit checks through mobile deposit.
That's music to my ears.
Learn more at penfed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
So when you say persistence, let's drill down on that a little bit for our listeners, because when I think of persistence from a combat perspective, like I have air superiority, I'm in the airspace, I am overhead all the time.
Yep. I think.
How does that work from a mobility standpoint?
I would say the same thing. I would add to it this. We need to have the effects we want when we want them, and we shouldn't be always waiting on a reset that takes 12 to 24 hours or name your timeline. You think about the amount of sorties we're flying on the ATO schedule in a permissive environment, 1,000, 2,000, you name your thing. We can do that all day long if the environment is permissive.
Okay, yeah.
But I'm talking, we're projecting powers from the bombers from the CONUS, integrating with tankers in theater, fighter units spread throughout in an ACE construct, somehow managing to integrate that with the joint team. I'm talking persistence in terms of, can this force do what it has to do to win?
And one of the things that shocked me is I had very little situational awareness of how disconnected the mobility force is.
Yep.
I mean, their ability to have situational awareness on threats, on what's going on within the battle space, even data links and something as simple as weather.
Yep.
How do we see too air mobility across these vast distances, which is vast time, in an agile way?
Yep. I don't want to hog the ball too much. I know Rob's got ideas on this, but here's my overall thought. First of all, there's this, it's horrible, and I hate to use it, but I will, because it makes the point very clearly. How do you know you've been engaged by the enemy when you're a KC-135 pilot? When you wake up in heaven. So, I mean, it's horrific, but it's true. We've got more connectivity in your cell phone and in your car than our mobility pilots have in their airplanes. And so when we looked at our fleet, we said, which platforms, or what's the percentage of platforms that we need that have the connectivity to be successful in a high-end pure fight with China? It's less than 10%. And that's where I came up with that 25 by 25, which was affordable, by the way. And this wasn't technology that had to be developed. It's stuff that we could buy right now, stick on the airplanes, and we'd be in great shape. And this all gets to the ability to, what I would call the maneuver battle management. It's the 1,000 things that need to happen so that we have the privilege, and I say this as an airman, so that we have the privilege to execute a kill chain, right? The 1,000 things that need to happen to put our strikers in a position to be lethal is maneuver battle management. And right now, because we're not connected, we can't even begin to have a high-level discussion on the command and control that makes all that happen.
Oh, yeah, and the command and control is a whole separate subject that we have to be able to integrate within across the entire mobility fleet. Rob, I want to come back to you because we were talking about the Cold War airlift force, and you did a really nice job of being able to explain the concepts, the tempo, the range, the attributes of the battle space. And as you mentioned, this was all focused on Europe, and we would move forces from the Pacific so that we could go win that Russia fight. Supplies were pre-positioned and bases were pretty established. Contrast that again with the problem that we'll see in the Pacific.
Well, General Minihan ably said, you're dealing with the tyranny of distance, the tyranny of water, and the absence of airfields. Some years back, I did a study on air refueling basing in the first island chain, and I had information on how many tankers we plan to deploy. So I went out, I just manually counted parking spots for tankers in the second and first island chain. And what I can tell you is there was parking for less than 30% of the tankers we expected to have there. So we could go to the fight, but we just run out of gas walking around looking for a place to park. Now that's been remediated quite a bit, but I'll bet it's not been remediated to 100%. I don't have a lot of direct experience in the Pacific except for a couple of flights to Australia. But it watered my eyes is how far distances were. And that's what we have to deal with. We have an inadequate fleet. And we need different airplanes. We look at the C-5. That's a great airplane. I think we should have bought more at one
heavens,
point.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, the next airplane is probably to replace it, needs to have the capacity and range of at least an AN-125, which is about 50% more capability. Maybe two, to operate on an ordinary airfield. We just got to be able to move a lot quicker. And a 100-ton airplane, which is a C-5, is not as effective as a 200-ton airplane. And if we can get more, that's great too, although there's got to be some limitation to how much weight you can put on some of those islands. So the challenge Pacific raises not only operational issues and command and control issues, it really does challenge our long raised perception of what it is we need to have and what those airplanes are going to look like.
One of the things I really enjoyed about your report is for those of us that aren't in the business, you do a really nice job of educating the reader about the different types of challenges and considerations that air mobility has to take when you're planning out how are you going to sustain a force. So everything from, as you mentioned, Rob, how many tons you can carry to what's the quality of the asphalt. Do you have the necessary fuel? How much ramp space do you have? Can you offload that? Do you have the equipment that you need to be able to offload? These are all things that in a pointy nose I take for granted because our air mobility and logisticians just magically make everything happen. But we can't take that for granted. And so when you look at the Pacific, I'm beginning to think we probably need to have more of a heterogeneous force to be able to handle the limitations of the infrastructure that exist across the different bases and the different islands.
Yeah. We need a mix. And that's where we came up with this next generation airlift and next generation air refueling systems. And if I had to change INGAL, I would change it to INGALs, because I left off the S. And so it kind of morphed into a replacement for a single aircraft as opposed to the system that needs to require, right? That needs to approach us. We need things that are autonomous, small tactical to medium-sized drones that can go forward and into high weapons engagement zones and be successful. And oh, by the way, they work all night and all day while you're sleeping and doing other things. We need to marry those with not only the kit we have that exists today, but also the kit that will be developed in the future. The weapon systems that have the autonomy, the weapon systems that have the connectivity, the weapon systems that can drop munitions even from an airlift platform, which I fully support. And I hope you ask me about that later. And then we've got to build something that replaces the C-17. We can't just service life extend our way into someone else being mad at us 20 years from now because we didn't make the tough decisions. The decisions we need to make are we need to make the now more affordable so that we can afford the future. Because right now, the now is so expensive, we can't afford the future. And mobility continues to be the offset for the others, and that's got to stop or we're going to fail in a future battlefield or battle skies. We have got to, as a nation, we've proved this, especially as the forces moved more towards the CONUS, is we got to be able to handle large volume C-5 things. I can't think of anything more difficult than building a large airplane. Can you? I mean, if you think about what's bigger than an A380 and what's bigger than a 747, I think there's less than 200, even with the Russians and the Ukrainians involved. So it's incredibly hard. And that's probably including Howard Hughes's Spruce Goose.
Spruce Goose, yeah.
So it's a hard thing to do, but we have an industry that can deliver those type of things.
Well, and it's been the crown jewel of American industry.
Right.
Is frankly our aircraft industry.
Yeah.
Their ability to build those kind of complex large aircraft.
Yeah, but we got to let them, and we got to do it in a fashion that doesn't wait for the requirement to go through the normal process. So by the time we have the solution, it's 30 or 40 years from now. This is, Rob's got this right. This is a now thing. And so this isn't an extend the life of the C-5s again so that we can have the same results, spend billions of more dollars on it. I love the airplane. It's fantastic.
But what I would say is I have seen divest to invest fail so many times. We can't do that. And so divesting can't be the way that we make the now more affordable. I would
agree.
just simply say we have got to get increased resourcing and increase the Air Force TOA so that we can do this because we've been neck down for so long. And when you add in pass-through funding, it just is going to break.
Yep, you got it. So I agree with that. And I would take it one next. What if there was, I wrote a paper on disposition reform. What if we gave the old KC-10s to a commercial partner that would operate them all day long in the knitter, all day long?
Like a craft.
You got it. In fact, I call it craft tea.
Okay.
So what if the KC-10s instead of...
There is an issue, if I can jump in.
Yep.
In equipping people you support on with antique airplanes. Antiques are a problem, and we all know they're harder to support. We know what happened to the DC-10 just recently. You face all kinds of root obsolescence problems. What we really need to do is figure out how to give supporters, how do we constitute them, new airplanes, new KC-46s and new whatever we come up with, but take advantage of their cost effectiveness to provide what they're good at, which is enough airlift to reduce the utilization of our principal fleet and also to provide a substantial mobilization capacity that we don't, well, we can, but it's not as much. So that's an issue. Our problem with our fleet right now is not that we have three types of transports or whatever. So we have three types of antiques. We need new airplanes.
Yep.
And a couple of quick sound bites. One, I had a chance to walk through, I had a personal tour of this Bruce gave, and I can tell you it lived up to Howard Hughes's record of only producing airplanes that are half a generation late and unproducible.
Sure.
Yeah. He was not an airplane builder
Yeah.
of any note. But the other issue is I hear all this, and we are focused on airplanes, and I'm going to beat my drum one more time. We got to be fully aware of the whole transportation equation.
The value of the airlift fleet is that it can get there in time and with tempo, and you can use it over and over and over.
We're the meaningful maneuver.
Yes.
Right. The meaningful maneuver is the way I describe it. When I got to Air Mobility Command, we threw a number. We used 2047, the 100th year anniversary of the Air Force, and we just said, I'll be 80, by the way, then. And if I could somehow creep my way into the Air Force Ball that year, would I be proud of what I saw on the flight line based on what we're doing in my headquarters for that time? And that's where we took cigars and scotch and we went out on the back porch of the old officers club and we whiteboarded a plan to get after something that not just be proud of, but be successful in combat for the current environment and future environments, and not have what I inherited, which is a fleet that my granddad, an Air Force plank holder, could show up and actually get in an airplane that he
And
flew.
go start.
And
Yeah.
and he'd know exactly. I mean, he could start even the latest version of the KC-135. I mean, he could do that. And so what we need to do is that's where NGAS and NGAL came on. And we need to approach the whole ecosystem from the high weapons engagement zone to the low weapons engagement zone, from the tactical, the operational, the strategic. We got to have severe joint integration, which gets to all the other kinds of lift, both organic and in a greater pool. And we need to be able to be successful to explode a force into theater, maneuver it into position of advantage, and sustain it throughout the whole life. You and I grew up saying, if in 6 months, we're going to build up and come kick your ass.
We're not going to have 6 months.
We're not going to have 6 months. So this explode can really only happen with airlift. So the things we need are autonomy. We absolutely need connectivity. We do need large volume airlift. We do need to commercialize certain parts of our thing. The C5 and the KC-10, I get it that they're old platforms, but they do have life in them. And for the C5, the half the time it works really good. And that's not something to just throw away. And while I do want to give our partners new stuff, I need to start that transition earlier so that we don't hamper the force forever on a platform that's dying. We use the C-141 as an example of greatness, and it is. But we flew the wings off of it. We flew the wings off of Desert Storm. We did the same thing to the C-130Es. And that's how airplanes decide their death, not humans. So we need to be
Because when you say we flew the wings off, you are being very literal.
Yes.
The wing boxes break.
You're right. You're right. And so let's be the generation of airmen that are good stewards of mobility. And let's determine how we sunset these airplanes instead of letting them determine how they fall off the cliff.
Because that then creates a crisis.
Yeah.
It creates a crisis for the aircraft, creates a crisis for that next program, and it creates a crisis for the pilots as well, in addition to the broader impact of not being able to provide that mobility.
You got it. And so let's hypothetically say there's a critical malfunction on pick your platform mobility. A C-17 has a critical wing issue. And then the world turns to us and goes, what's your plan, Air Force? We don't have one. Our plan is to extend them another 2 decades. And that's
75 years old for a C-17.
You got it. So the time is now to do the push-ups. In fact, the time to do the push-up was probably 15 years ago. But what's going to follow the C-17? What's going to follow the C-5? I think it's commercial variants. What's going to follow the C-130s? How are they going to morph? What's the competition out there that can develop this holistic approach? And really, with one thing in mind, we have got to maneuver in the Pacific against the highest threat and be successful, put our strikers in a position of advantage. And then that's the report cards the future generations will hold us against.
And we're going to have to operate mobility within that threat regime, whether or not that's low threat or a high threat density. Rob, during the Cold War, you were expected to fly sorties while under attack. Talk to us about that perspective, because I think today we don't really think about airlift going into a threat zone. We've been operating in permissive environments for the last 30 years.
Well, sadly, we expected to take casualties. I was in a DC-130 squadron, currently assigned to Europe, and then with one rotational squadron at Mildenhall. And as I was the assistant war planner for the wing, so I went and looked at the various operational orders. And I found out on the first day, we had 3 major missions, bringing A-10s up from Malcolmbury, bringing the 1st and the 509th up from Aviano, and moving a M113 TOW missile unit laterally across the line. What I determined was we weren't going to live past the first day. And first of all, we couldn't do any one of those missions well, let alone all 3 of them. There was just a disconnect. Everybody expected the C-130s belonged to them, and nobody talked to anybody else. But the plan was there were about 10 C-130 squadrons in the States available, and they would rotate in one a day and assume they would take casualties. So that was the reality of it. And that was the reality of the whole airplane, basically, was that we would use up those air forces. And when they ran out, either everybody quit or then they started cocking nuclear weapons. Europe was a pretty hairy place to be and to think about what could happen in the space of a week or even a few days. And this is a personal thing. I remember sitting down with my young wife. We put together an escape kit for her, and we went out literally and did reconnaissance on a couple of roads to Luxembourg. And then I told her, if I go in, don't expect to see me. Just run for France as fast as you can. And that was the reality. It was a different environment. Now, are we going to face that kind of environment? You know, we're not fighting some little Tom, Dick, and Harry terrorist group or dictator. We're fighting a country, potentially 2 countries with nuclear weapons, and both of them with the leadership that has a deeply vested interest in not coming out second. And i.e., if they do, they'll go to the wall. So, yeah, we're kind of facing that. And I don't know that we fully understand that, what it means. We can't own enough stuff probably to win that war outright with conventional forces. And we're all absolutely terrified of what that could mean if we let the war get out of place. So I completed a book about a year ago on the whole issue of restraining air power. We always talk about exploding into the theater. There is the issue of sealing yourself gently around in the dark as well. Yeah, we want to blow the enemy away and overwhelm them with our dexterity, but, you know, there's a limit to what they'll take. So air power has this tremendous advantage, but it also can trigger things that we don't want to trigger.
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons why we need to really aggressively preposition stockpiles. We need to have those capabilities, whether or not that's MREs or fuel or bullets and other equipment forward. But I don't think anyone really thinks that we will be initiating hostilities. I think that we will be responding to hostilities. But when that happens, however any trigger might go forward, I do think that we need to be able to explode. And we need to, and more importantly, have that capability and capacity so that we can deter. And that's, in terms of avoiding, I think avoiding conflict comes from a position of strength, not from one that is soft or conciliatory.
Yeah, I agree. The deterrence lens I use is we need to communicate will, we need to deny benefit, we need to impose cost. And you do that through reveal, not conceal. Exploding into theater has an enormous deterrence value in itself, but all that readiness that explodes us into theater is also what gives you the decisive victory.
I totally agree. And Rob, one of the things that you mentioned that I think is interesting that we do not have today is the strategic depth of force.
Yep.
So when C-130s got shot down, Rob, your era expected that we would have more that could flow into theater to then pick up the pace and keep things moving. And we just simply don't have that kind of those kinds of numbers anymore. Yeah. Mass matters.
If you want to look at what a war of attrition looks like with no maneuver, look in Ukraine right now. That's what awaits us in the Pacific. And each side spastically gets some advantage every now and again, but they can never seal the deal. Then the other side rises up, and so it's this.
It's purely a two-dimensional land fight,
it's
right?
It's done for World War I.
Because they don't have air superiority, they don't have deep strike to deny sanctuary, and they don't have mobility and logistics.
They don't have maneuver. Getting back to what you asked earlier, I think is really good. We have got to develop the capability. And if one part of the force goes in to the high WES and inside the first island chain, then I'm not saying the entire mobility force needs to do that, but this is where the systems approach came up to NGAL and NGAS. There needs to be a CCA tanker. There needs to be a KC-21X or a KC-XX that looks stealth-like that can go inside the high res. But there needs to be. I'm not saying there need to be big numbers, but there needs to be enough to get the strikers where they need to go, into the most extreme target areas. And then there needs to be tankers that look a lot like what we have today, and probably will look exactly like we have today, that can handle the more permissive environments and stuff like that. So this family approach to both the tanking and the lift needs to occur so that we can handle not just the operational, tactical, and strategic, but also the high, medium, and low res. And then also we build them in an affordable way that says it's not one size fits all. That you create efficiencies and effectiveness by smaller fleets that have more precise missions to get after it. But the fleet we have now, to be clear, is second generation airlift and air refueling. I refuse to give it a higher grade, and maybe a 2.5 generation. And yet we got fifth and sixth generation that they're supporting, and that's just incompatible. It's incompatible when it comes to the effects that you want on the battlefield.
Yeah, because you're not going to be able to get the fifth and sixth generation there if you don't have the rest of the mobility and logistics. We've got to improve the capabilities there.
Yes.
And field newer generations. One thing I liked about what you said was, we talk about strategic, operational, tactical, but also we need to think about the spectrum of the threat environment. In ACE, it's going to demand servicing a lot of smaller distributed outposts, and they will also be contextualized by that different threat environment. How should we think about that? What's needed there?
Yeah, I call it maneuver battle management. We talked about this a little bit earlier about, what are the 1,000 things that need to happen to make a kill chain successful, to have the privilege to execute a kill chain. But think about an algorithmic approach to command and control that senses priority. Think about your Uber or your Lyft that I'm probably going to use on the way out of this session, all right? Or think about Waymo in California. Think about how a user defines a need. It determines the size, the distance. You get to pick the quality. You get to pick, you could even pick a driver. You have a lot of say in how the supply and the demand of that situation goes. And then it just solves for the best possible outcome. You can even pay more to have higher priority. But think about, some sort of algorithmic approach to this so that you are always servicing the highest priority and that you actually know what's going on with red, know what's going on with blue. I mean, I think the analogy is pretty good. It interacts with people that aren't playing with Uber, Lyft, and Waymo. So it doesn't have to be everybody, but it understands that. And then think about how we can get away from orbits and anchors and channels and just hey, we're going to go to A to B, and if you don't meet us there, you're out of luck. And that I can actually get what you want, where you need it, when you need it, in a more precise way. And I know it won't be 100% perfect, but it'll be better than a 1950s approach to air refueling and a 1950s approach to airlift, which is the thing we need to do to win. I mean, this is exactly what we need to do to win.
So I want to see that tested, because I hear people talk about that analogy, the Uber analogy, for everything from either mobility or tanking to more confoundingly targets, right? How you're going to service targets. But I want to see that exercised.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, it starts with connectivity. First, you can't do anything if you can't communicate, or if you're held hostage to a brief that's 12 hours old, or you're also held hostage to line of sight UHF communication. I mean, so let's be clear. None of that exists unless we get the connectivity and the entire force that's needed. If the enabling force doesn't have that connectivity, then let's go back to 1950 and draw tanker tracks and orbit points and cross our fingers.
Which we're simply not going to have the privilege of being able to do because we don't have the excess capacity given the scope of the geography within the Pacific.
Yep.
We stacked tanker orbits on top of each other during the course of Vietnam when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that still seemed kind of far away if you're a little fighter like me that had no gas.
Yeah.
But when you're looking at the Pacific, that problem is so much more vast that I agree. We can't just plunk a couple tracks here and there and hope it all works out.
So I get it. I'm shallow on example. I mean, I get that. With Uber and Lyft, I mean, it runs out of steam real quick unless you try, unless somebody says it's priority and funds it, unless, it seems that the people that are running Uber, Lyft, and Waymo have figured it out. And it's very complex. I'm not saying it's as complex as an air campaign, but they figured it out, and we can try. We can land on the moon. I think we can figure this out. If you have more connectivity and integration playing Fortnite, your kids playing Fortnite, then I think we can invest in this and have a much better outcome than the one we're experiencing right now.
Rob, what are your thoughts?
The points are all well taken. And the issue is, you need the fleet and the command and control. And I would argue that we need to think again about agile combat employment. We can't go up and do a really complex ballet of tankers to support complex operations and then land them on predictable parking spots and park them there for the next 12 hours while you wait for the next big mission. That's one of the key weaknesses of our current concept. And partly our fleet, because they're all airliners and they need lots of runways, but partly because it's just the way we think about doing those operations.
One of the things that we haven't really talked deeply about, but we've danced around, is the notion of the Civil Air Reserve Fleet. I'd like to hear both of your thoughts about where we should husband that force going into the future. I mean, when we looked at Kabul, we came out of Kabul, a lot of folks don't realize how thin our mobility fleet is because we had to activate the craft to do that, to finish that off. They will be an essential element moving forward.
Yep. I think the craft is awesome. I mean, they're phenomenal partners. Your readout of Kabul is spot on. I think we need to enlarge craft, both in terms of numbers, but also capability, as Rob said. We need, I think, large aircraft, much larger than are being produced right now in it. I think we need to expand it to the craft T is the caveman I'm using.
Tankers on the back.
But I do believe we need to give excess capacity that sits in a boneyard and rots away, gets auctioned off to the highest bidder that wants to scrape off engines or go to a foreign country. And we need to preserve the capability that America invested in it in the first place. And we need to give it to teammates that want to still contribute to national security and national defense. Same thing for the C-5. There's just got to be a better way than riding this down until it's absolutely broken. And then those in turn participate in craft and craft T, whether it's a tanker or an airlift platform. And that's a magnificent way to have, a more elegant and dignified coming out of the uniform service than it currently does right now. And I think craft in those two lenses is very viable. It's already very successful. It's not just a military capability, but it's juice for the commercial industry, certainly. And I think both you and I have deployed on craft partners going back and forth from the sand. They're certainly very professional and they get it. And we are going to have, if you think that Kabul was hard, wait till we do, wait till we're trying to set the force in the Pacific. I go back to Paparo saying, Paparo said, I've expanded it. We're not ready enough, integrated enough, agile enough. And regardless of how ready, integrated, and agile are, I will never admit to being ready, integrated, and agile enough, ever. So I will never turn down a tail. I will, and nor have I ever been a day in my life where I was like, oh, requirements, we got them. We've got enough capacity to meet the requirements. And I know that if this were to go down the Pacific, that we would be scrambling to have everything playing on our team possible. And we need to move out aggressively on that right now.
So from a business perspective, I can see where the cargo piece fits in, right? I mean, Amazon, anyone else would want to have that super heavy airlift, right? That seems like it makes sense. But from a business perspective, how do you support a craft T?
Craft T, there's more people that require refueling than just United States of America, but we're also, the largest customer and the largest provider of air refueling. So the KC-10 is a great example. Secretly, have you ever flown in it?
No, I've tanked off of a KC-10.
It's amazing. It's an amazing airplane, but it's as good a cargo platform as it is a tanker. Yeah. Even in the dual role, it's magnificent. So that's one example of where commercial could also do cargo and air refueling. But I think there's a vibrant need in the international community. If you were just to line up who's buying F-35s and then what countries want, and then how they want to project power, then what do you think Europe would do right now if you offered them a commercial option for tankers? I think they'd be all over it. So
because it's a great opopportunity to be able to have the capability and the fuel capacity.
I think Matria and Omega are doing just that. They're training the German Air Force, and they're subcontracted to the French. I mean, they're already offering commercial capabilities in tanking.
And frankly, we need it too. I can't tell you how many times I've seen movements to exercises stopped and on hold because there isn't sufficient tankers.
Yeah, and this gets back to your divest to invest. I agree with you, but we can do things thoughtfully that keep the capability just in a different manner that make it affordable. And I know it's not perfect. I mean, we're in a position where we have to do some unconventional things to get out of the hole. and not just go down the same solution. We're going to SLEP, Service Life Extend program, something. We're going to add 20 more years of life to this. The conversations that were happening when the C5M when it was being re-engined and recockpitted and all that stuff are a decade old, and look at what we've got now. It's a great airplane. We've got to transition it so that we can get to something better.
Yeah.
It's not only the craft, but it also has implications for our air refueling concepts in the future. But, the craft, when it was formed in 1952, had two primary jobs. One was to download the military fleet so that it could fly only what was required for readiness. And in the initial regulations, the military fleet was only allowed to fly each airplane 4 hours a day. And on average, the crews were about an hour and a half a day. And the idea was that would stretch out an expensive military capability. And the other one was this notion that the craft and its crews can't be put at risk.
I was going to ask that. I was going to ask that.
If it truly is a high-threat environment, you're not going to put a military transport there. What you want to do is develop concepts and equipment that'll let you go there without being in a high threat. But the idea that the craft crew can't be under threat, again, is not written anywhere. It's not consistent with mobilization and impressment laws. In a major war, they could be approaching a war for survival. If we need to put those guys out there, if they say no, we induct them into the military, put them in uniforms, and make them subject to the Code of Military Justice. That was the threat in World War II, discussed at the Wings Club. What happens if we say no? And what the answer was that you'll simply be impressed into the United States Army Air Corps. And the Air Corps had already cut the orders. The Army staff had already cut the orders. So that's always been in the background, that if you have to go, you have to go. And they're going to be under threat. In a big war like that, they're going to face threats. I did a threat analysis some years back, and I looked at the things that can threaten our ability to mobilize. And one of which was killing craft crewmen or shooting their families on their front doors. That's pretty violent, but that's what the Russians planned to do with several of those smaller Scandinavian air forces. They knew they couldn't find the planes, so their plan was they would shoot the families, and that would dissuade the pilots from going. So what I would argue that the way forward on the craft is, one, those two issues need to be addressed. And also the percentage of the craft that's identified, or the percentage of the airline industry that's identified with the craft. Right now, it's about 7%. It needs to be increased. Maybe a craft phase 4, well, they're not formally exercised or identified, but we know that another percentage of the airline fleet is identified by tail number, and the airlines just simply have to find the additional people. Yeah, there's lots of capacity that's not been organized and mobilized, and it could be. We had 15% of the airline industry in the craft in the 1960s. There were smaller airplanes and a smaller fleet, but it was 15%. Why not today? That would be equivalent to 500 more airplanes in the craft.
And that'd be very useful. I mean, it's been a long time since we've had a whole-of-nation approach to war. And if we were to enter into a peer conflict with China or Russia, we would need to be prepared to do something like that.
That's another podcast on supply chain, which we worked hard at Air Mobility Command. But the other thing we did is we included craft partners in the high-end exercise. So the Mobility Guardian we did in 23, taking advantage of the twice-per-year interactions with the craft leadership and talking everything that Rob just highlighted. How do we incorporate them and give them a realistic sense of what's going to happen? How do you pass intel briefs that are pertinent to where they're flying? And it's the commercial partners, it's the craft, if it gets activated, it's all those things. But you have to do things now with them at a high level so that you have that capacity when it's crisis and conflict. They're wonderful. I'll tell you one quick story. The quick story is, craft, you said craft was activated for Kabul. It was. And in one of the debriefs I took right after, I wasn't in for the Kabul evacuation, but I came in literally weeks afterwards. And one of the partners, and this was not a whine, it was just hey, we're waiting a long time for the logistics to happen once we get to drop off, whatever mission they had for Kabul. Mm-hmm. Too long a wait to get the servicing, have the things happen to the crew that need to happen so that they can reset. And in my mind, I'm going, well, you ain't seen nothing yet. If you think that delay is critical and painful, wait till we start doing this in the Pacific in a high-end fight. We'll be contested in every domain from the word go. at great distances, fighting a peer that knows the value of the mobility fleet, airlift tanking, aeronautical evacuation, and certainly the commercial side of that. So the time is now to work on that. And we took a good first shot at it. It needs to develop much more robustness to be viable, but we got to continue those things moving into the future so it's actually there when we need it, not we're thinking about it while we need it.
Yeah, I mean, and so in terms of preparing for the future, the Air Force just released a memo discussing airlift modernization, and I have to compliment them on saying that the force needs a reset.
Yep.
Thank goodness we are finally getting that from the entire Air Force enterprise. However, I was surprised to see how long they think the current airlifters will last. And we've talked about that throughout the course of this podcast, because I don't think the Air Force wants this. This is resource driven from my perspective. What are your thoughts?
It's never had money for it, never. Historically, there have been two times when we've had airlift revolutions. One was in 1960-62 at the National Airlift hearings. Imagine that. And then in that one, we got the C-141, the C-130E, and the startup on the C-5. So we had modern airlift. And the other time was in the 1980s, dealing with the C-17 and trying to keep that alive. So it's a complicated process. You got to identify the airplanes, you got to develop the capabilities, you got to develop the crew force and the mindset, at which General Minihan was spot on when we started to realize you had to train mobility airmen to start thinking like combat airmen, which they hadn't had to do. Their world was an airline-type world of flying back and forth to the sandbox. And there were a lot of pilots that had never done it any other way. And the idea that they were going to have to go someplace where they might get shot at was new stuff. I'll give you a personal anecdote. I taught the craft. I taught a course every semester for years on the commercial airline industry. And one of the lessons to the students was, and these are all would-be airline pilots, was on the craft. I explained what it was, and I would ask them, do you realize you're going to be in an organized military reserve when you take that dream job from Delta or American? It's in your contract. You're in the craft.
I think our mobility airmen do have that spirit of war fighting in them. I think they just needed the leadership and the perspective to reignite that.
Let me answer your question. I'm concerned that the standard approach to extending life on already obsolete aircraft needed for the current fight is going to yield the same old results and just put us further and further behind. So if you want to talk to me about service life extension programs that automate, like let's pick a KC-135. If you're going to say you're going to extend them another 30 years, then let's take the pilots out and make them connected hotspots downrange. And instead of park them in the boneyard, let's park them on, a ramp and fly them unmanned. I'm interested in that conversation. If you want to take the C-17 and extend its life with some modest upgrades while you're co-developing its follow-on, to give it a little more cowbell for, the next 10 or 15 years so that what follows it is really going to be dazzling, I'm interested in that conversation. But if we think that the same stale approach to our standard C-17, KC-135, C-5 capabilities is going to somehow magically be awesome in the next round, I don't get it. I just don't get it. So we have got to look ourselves in the mirror and make a hard decision to actually spend money on mobility that's normally associated with the amounts of money we spend on the pointy end. And this is not to right or wrong. This is to get back to the very beginning of this podcast. This is about balance and equilibrium so that the enabling force can put the strike force in a position of advantage to be successful. Project power, project hope. We have got to get this right. So I don't get a lot of warmth thinking that we're just going to cutesy our way out of another tough mobility conversation and think that we're going to be better for it.
That's the course of least resistance. And that's not going to get us to a position of victory. And I completely agree. What I like about what you're saying is experimenting with autonomy. Put autonomy into the older aircraft and fly them that way. That way that allows you to potentially grow your capacity, grow your force extension in ways that also prove out the autonomy where the autonomy might be mature enough to execute that mission set. I want to transition because I love where you're going. How do we know whether or not we're doing the right things? 5 years, 10 years from now, where should we be?
Where should we be in 5-10 years from now? We should be well on our way to producing a C-17 follow-on. We should be well on our way to having something that can lift the volume of the C-5 with something newer and reliable. We need to be in the 90 percentile and not the lower 50 percentile or upper 40 percentile when it comes to mission effectiveness. We need to have a kit out there that is autonomous, that can get after the small and medium lift capabilities, that is doing the push-ups while you're sleeping and doing other things that are more important. We need to have the command and control that takes advantage of the connectivity that we invest so that we can do maneuver battle management, again for the third time, hitting this, the 1,000 things that need to happen so that we have the privilege to execute a kill chain. That needs to be 100% something that we're not just talking about and doing. And you talked about, hey, we're always talking about Lyft and Uber and Waymo, whatever it's called, which I wrote in one and was awesome. But we need to quit talking about that and actually just start doing it.
Yeah, and not just to make that mature for the mission set and area that we have to explore the edge cases, but also to make sure that it works the way we envision and that it actually has the command and control and the priorities that we think it should. Yeah.
One last thing, and I know Rob's going to clean me up to 100% here. We tend to blame others when we don't get the resourcing. They don't get it. We need to do a real hard mirror check here. Roll up the sleeves and let's do a call sign only debrief. And we need to say, are we articulating this right? Are we presenting a prepared and trusted force to the Hill and the resourcers? Are we actually getting after the necessary conversations and winning those conversations that deliver the resourcing and not just saying, well, they just don't get it? You've seen leadership needs to win critical conversations, and that starts with resourcing.
Okay, Rob, last words.
I'll be quick. 10 years from now, I'd like to see supply stocks and the maintenance force fully funded, fully equipped, fully stocked. That's the quickest way to get extra or recover lost air mobility capability. Our planes ought to be fixed. The second issue is the communications, command and control, both concepts and equipment need to be in place across the fleet. And the craft, we need to expand the craft, figure out how to do that. Those are three relatively inexpensive ways to recover and gain a lot of capacity. When it comes to aircraft modernization, General Minihan and I agree. Eventually, I'll try to bring him to the light. But the first airplane we need is an airplane optimized for the theater kinds of operations we'll see in the Pacific. We need a lot of range, outsized capacity, very aggressive airfield capabilities, ability to augment the strategic fleet when necessary, usefully, over long ranges and so forth. The big long-range airplane, to me, is the second priority. We have the capacity to do most of that mission now, and those airplanes probably will last a little longer.
So I'm going to add a little bit to what you were saying. So sorry, you don't get quite the final word, but you can correct me to 100%. Is it modernizing with the connectivity, the data links, the C2? That is, I think, something that we need to do for the force that we have today as we work to bring in new platforms.
Yep. It was $500 million when I left AMC to I mean, that's a rounding error in the big scheme of things. Dust. And you think about what this country spent on OCO back in the day. We could have done this in about a week and a half. And I was just asking for 25% of the fleet, and you get efficiencies moving forward. I know you want to finish, but I got to add two things here. I realize that there's a pot roast in the oven that we need to get home to. I like problem statements. As I work through an issue, I try to really get zeroed in on the problem statement. The problem statement I'm zeroed in now is, and this is universal, it's not just mobility. This is Air Force, this is Joint Force, this is Department of War. But we have to get winning capabilities to the warfighter faster than China. That's it. So that puts an umbrella almost everything we talked about today, from
winning capabilities in numbers.
Yeah. So you're right. You could add to it, but winning capabilities to the warfighter faster than China.
Yep.
And right now we're not doing that. They're kicking our butt at that all day long. They take a shortcut when we take the long route. They've got unification when we've got bifurcation. And when you really think about it in those terms, there is no wall we shouldn't knock down that's a barrier to that. Winning capabilities to the warfighter, and I think inherent in that is the numbers that matter. But that's really the way I look at the whole problem here. And so that means that, we need new kit, but we also need new concepts. We also need a new way of thinking. We need leaders that are willing to take a risk and move out for what matters to the mission and the airmen, and less about the safe play. We need, a whole new level of risk tolerance in the Air Force. And I'm not asking to go back to the day
We're not going to run with scissors.
yeah, where you're hurting people unnecessarily, but we need a whole new level of risk tolerance that actually accommodates the capabilities we need, delivers things to warfighters, and we've all been there. You get it. It's out of date, not in the numbers you need, and you don't understand how to use it. And the second you turn around, it's obsolete. So really, this warfighting capabilities, winning capabilities of warfighter has so many lenses you could go down, but it's the best way I can describe the depth of the change needed.
I think that's an amen moment.
I hope so.
Amen.
Can we please be the generation that didn't have to have a September 11th or a December 7th to wake up and figure it out? Can we snap ourselves to correctness ahead of that? I mean, we're awesome once we get slapped. We're awesome. We're awesome on December 8th. We get it.
It took us 2 years later to get super awesome.
Yeah, but we understood. We understood the situation instantly, and we're awesome on September 12th. You're right. We're slow to wake up, but once we do, we're a beast. Can we be the beast that wakes up ahead of time? And then any potential adversary looks at us and says, "I don't want a piece of it."
Yeah, not today.
Not today.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Take control, Heather.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great Aerospace Power kind of day. See you next time. That's a wrap. Okay, I got to tell you guys a story. I got to fly right in the cockpit of an AN-225.
Oh, that's cool.
It was 1991. The wall had not yet fallen, and they were doing the Goodwill game. So the Soviet Union sent over 2 Su-27 flankers and one of their ILs, and they brought in over their AN-225 to support the whole program. And the problem is that none of them spoke English. So they needed to have supervision to fly them around. And my dad happened to be flying a MiG-15 and 17 at the time. MiG-21 was later. It's civilian-wise, right? So he got asked to come up and escort the aircraft around for the purposes of the Goodwill Games and the air show that was going on in a MiG-15. And as a result, I was tagging along and got to go right up in an AN-225, and that thing was just enormous. It was bigger than God.
So cool.
It was amazing. And everything was like that turquoise blue, by the way.
I think the way they designed them, I mean, I love the way Russians put a gun on everything. And then when I was in Europe and we were trying to figure out how to airdrop in Serbia or someplace, there's actually a conveyor belt in some of their airplanes that could just, you didn't need to push things down rollers. You could turn on a conveyor belt and it just went out the end.
It's going to come out. Well, the Cold War was, and we're starting to run into that in the Pacific, but it was an opportunity for young people to have really amazing adventures. Yeah, stuff. One of my claims to fame was I overtemped the engines on a Tu-154 one time. The Frankfurt International was taxiing an airplane, and he took me off. He came flying off the runway, and Tower was yelling at him to stop, and he went right in front of me and then had to stop, and I was only about 30 feet behind him. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, I'll rock him a little bit. So I brought the inboards back just to kind of blow him. Well, apparently the engines are really delicate, and he had to shut them both down because they overtemped, and he didn't know why. And the Tower gave me permission to back up and go around him, which I did without saying a word. So I have that credit. I never stamped a 154 on my airplane, but I could claim one.
Love it.
There you go.
Silhouettes.
All right.